Are you somebody who knows the difference between their Origen and their Pantanus? Well, if not, keep watching and you might find out in Ancient Testimony, Part A. Hello and welcome to episode 0.02 of Living the Ministry Years. In the last episode, I kind of tried to present the case that actually, although the huge kind of weight of modern scholarship works with sort of compromise, often doesn't ask the question too hard about who wrote the Gospels, and kind of settles on a period just after the destruction of Jerusalem for when most of them were written, that actually it's not at all unreasonable to take a view as which we'd share with the early church, that the Gospels were written by the people they claim to be, and they were written quite early. So in this episode, of course, when I did that, it wasn't exactly a proof. It was just kind of giving you enough confidence to say, I'm not just sitting here making it up. There's serious thinking behind it. And so similarly with today, we're going to be looking at the testimony of the early church to the authorship of the Gospels. We won't be able to look in great detail and take every single argument and dissect it, but that's not actually the point of this series. My kind of assumption is that you're someone who is interested in how the Gospels fit together and they tell the story of Jesus in a way where we can understand the real dynamics of the real history. And I just, in that sense, I want to give folks enough information to kind of feel confident as we go forwards, that there is a solid kind of backing for the approach that we're going to take in the harmonization of the Gospels. So why don't we make a start? Start with the Gospel of Matthew, because that's the Gospel that universally the early church tell us was the first one to be written, even though modern scholarship thinks Mark must have been, because it's a bit rougher and a bit shorter. I'm going to give you quotes, so there's no way my memory will actually succeed in doing this. So I'm going to use various sources which I've got next to me to kind of read to you from. I thought I'd start with a book that I mentioned the other day, which is redating Matthew, Mark and Luke's John Wenham's approach. And in his chapter on the ancient testimony to Matthew's Gospel, I just thought I'd read his introductory sentences. So in his kind of summary of what he's going to look at in detail, he says, the fathers were almost unanimous in asserting that Matthew, the tax collector, was the author of writing first for the Hebrews in the Hebrew language, and then colon, and he gives us a list of them. So Papias, who lived from 60 to 130 AD, Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 200. See how they're just joining up. So 60 to 130, 130 to 200. Pantanius, who we know died around 190, so before Irenaeus did. Origen, who's writing from 185, so just picking up at the time where Irenaeus is finishing. Origen 185 to 254. Then Eusebius, who's about 260 to 340. Epiphanius, who's 315 to 403. Cyril of Jerusalem, 315 to 386. And others write in this vein. I just wanted to kind of pick up. You see that the kind of a whole suite. There's really hardly any gap from from 60 AD, which is within 30 years before, according to many modern theories, that the Gospels were even written. We have kind of testimony to the fact that Matthew's Gospel has been written first, from 60 right the way through up to the kind of 400 or so. And then he goes on and says, and there's also the medieval Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, Evan Bohan. And that's often a surprise to folks. It was certainly a surprise to me when I read it in here for the first time. So I went and kind of searched out a little bit. The backstory is it's around the medieval period. A couple of versions of Matthew's Gospel seem to appear within the Jewish community, and one in particular, which had been kind of dissected and was reproduced with arguments and counter-arguments from a Jewish perspective. Because remember that at this point the Jews were very persecuted in a Christian-dominated world. But somehow he had a version of the Gospel of Matthew, and you can kind of pull every bit out, although it's broken up with polemic against it, and you get a complete flow. You can actually buy a modern copy, so I have a copy here. And what's so fascinating, the reason why it has such a strong case for being a copy of the original is there are the slight variances. They're not kind of material in one sense, but they're not quite consistent with the idea of someone purely taking the Greek version of the Gospel and translating it back into Hebrew. There seems to be extra little nuances. So I put a little marker in, so I thought I'd give you kind of a mini example. So for instance, this is now Matthew 6 verse 30, which is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. So actually, if I read you the original first, let me see if I put my marker in here as well. So Matthew 60 verse 30. But if God so arrays the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more do so for you, you men of little faith? That's the verse in the Greek, translated into English from the Greek. And this is one in this kind of Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. It says, so if God so thinks of you, okay, that wasn't there. Don't be anxious for anything you shall eat. That's quoting a little bit earlier than I just read to from there, but adding a phrase that isn't there in the original. Don't be anxious saying, what should we eat and what should we drink? Because he knows your body seeks these things. Sorry, I've gone afterwards. My eye's been drawn to the wrong point. Sorry, it's the verse 30. So if God closed the straw with that is left standing in the grain that is penon. Well, I'm not quite sure what that phrase, that is penon, means, but actually even those words standing in the grain, is the stuff that's left standing in the grain, is a slight expansion of the kind of the flow, or the descriptive flow. Doesn't change the meaning, but it's slightly bigger description. And you have to say to yourself, why would somebody add those words if they were translating from Greek back into Hebrew? This is an example of the kind of thing I mean, which is fresh today and tomorrow is dried up, and then it's placed into the oven. So much more will he clothe you who are of little faith. So again, now there are some kind of nuanced little changes, and then it adds the bit that I then read, if God so thinks of you, which isn't there in the Greek version. So there is a strong case for saying actually what we actually have is we have in translation a copy. We are able to reconstruct a kind of the Hebrew version of Matthew. There are changes like that right the way through it. So you can see it's not just someone being lazy in their translation, because sometimes they've added little extra nuances and so on. So there is a kind of a strong case, but for the sake of this video, all I really wanted to do, because we're not going to be able to prove to those that want to be skeptical, I just want to give you kind of, if you're coming to this and you've not seen these things before, kind of a fresh confidence that actually there is a long tradition that has real sense to it, that allows us both to see the Gospels as being written early and also by the people who said they knew what they were. So before I start to read these quotes, you'll notice every now and again we will hit a bit of a contradiction. And it's partly because we hit those kind of contradictions that modern scholarship has found an excuse to ignore everything. And that seems to be the wrong way round, because we know something happened. And if you kind of ignore the eyewitnesses, or the witnesses in this case, the early church fathers, if you ignore their testimony totally, you end up just making something up that is really reflective of the kind of the spirit of the age. And in the 21st century, if we're very cynical, we just write something very cynical. We have to take them seriously. And actually, there are good principles for doing that. So, for instance, you may not have thought of it like this, but as someone who's written several books now and often drawn from my own history and testimony to illustrate them, it's much, much easier, for instance, to be able to identify the season of the year than it is the year that something happened. That seems odd because you think the year is so big. But you see, when you look back, you remember, oh, well, the sun was up and we were all wearing T-shirts. So I know it was the summer. So it was in the summer. But was it 1990 or was it 91? Actually, it was 95. And so, funny enough, things like getting years wrong is actually quite easy. And so we will sometimes see that there are some of the contradictions are in terms of dating based on that big picture of the year. And it's very easy as well to get fixed in your head a year and then you kind of repeat it. I did exactly that in the previous video where I was referring to the publication of John Carmignac books, which I made the reference 79 to 80, and I think in fact it was 86 and 87. But for some reason while I was talking I was absolutely convinced on, and by the time I'd finished the video it was too late, so I put the amendment as a kind of a separate video tag. So things like that are just kind of part of normal kind of human life. But the fundamental stories we'll see don't contradict. It's just kind of little details, and those details do kind of juggle things around a little bit. Strangely, it creates a little bit of ambiguity. as to whether, for instance, Mark the Gospel writer is the same as John Mark, who travels with Paul. And we've got a bit of a contradiction as to our understanding of that, but we also have some conformity. We can say some things about them. And similarly, is John the Gospel writer the same as John the Apostle, or is he someone called John the Elder that we know about independently? And so we can get some contradictions around that, and that's very often that there's a kind of quite understandable when you're writing sort of by memory, and we find similar contradictions around Philip the Evangelist versus Philip the Apostle. That kind of you can, but it's not difficult to imagine how someone who's remembering a genuine tradition, but has got confused as to whether it's the evangelist or the apostle, and so then you can kind of create a bit of a contradiction. Was, oh well, he wasn't there then, was he? So that therefore we dismiss the whole thing. So we have to take those things into account. But anyway, let's get on to it. Let's start with Matthew. As I say, there's that strong tradition just read from John Wenham. It's pretty much uniform. I just thought I'd kind of bring out some of those. So he mentions Papias. He also mentions Eusebius, and we get most of our quotes from Papias via Eusebius. Now, sometimes Eusebius has a slight kind of agenda, but despite having an agenda. So, for instance, part of his agenda, he refers to Papias as being a man of little intellect, and that as we look at that, we see totally his agenda, which is. Eusebius is writing in the 4th century and is very excited by some of the new theology that is coming along, which sadly is going to lose, if you like, some of the older theology of the early church fathers. So he's very excited by that, and he sees Papias as being part of that old tradition, and so he's rather disparaging and kind of says, well, he's not got much intellect. But even despite that, he is reckoned to be a very accurate copyist in the way he quotes from other places. And so we apply that to Papias, although we don't have this quote from elsewhere. So he tells us, quoting Papias, that Matthew compiled the reports, this is of Jesus, in a Hebrew dialect, but each interpreted them as he could. So he's giving us a kind of a basic understanding. So Matthew's he's compiling them in Hebrew, and it's ambiguous as to whether it means he wrote them down or whether he as Jesus was speaking, or whether he wrote them down after, or whether it's both, and kind of the word is kind of comprehensive, carries all of those things. And he goes on to tell us that actually Papias' source of his knowledge comes from John the Elder, who, as I say, could be a bit ambiguous. Is it John the Apostle or John the Elder? But it's a separate character, John the Elder, and someone called Aristian, both of whom were disciples of Jesus, according to Eusebius. And that's interesting in its own way, just a little bit of kind of corroborative things, evidence. Mark's Gospel, all the earliest manuscripts kind of finish with verse 9 of the last chapter. So Mark 16, verse 9 is the last verse. But then there's some other verses added on, which is a kind of summary about how the Gospel went out from there to the whole world. And it's kind of universally acknowledged that the kind of style of writing and so on, those extra verses aren't the same as the rest of the Gospel. But what's interesting is there's an ancient manuscript, an illuminated manuscript, which apparently was based on a 2nd century manuscript. Unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. But actually, it has the name Aristian at the introduction of the conclusion of Mark, in a way that clearly tells us that the copyist is reflecting the fact that in the original manuscript, Aristian was marked as the author of that final conclusion. Which is kind of really nice. For me, that you may not be interested in that, but you go and have a look at it. You'll see the ending is very different. The earliest manuscripts don't contain it, but it's been around from a very, very long period. It's still very early, that ending. And actually we have now a testimony of someone who we know was actually a disciple of Jesus, i.e. probably one of the 72, a guy called Aristian, suddenly emerges out of nowhere. But anyway, that's a by the by. It's just a little side that comes out of Eusebius quoting Papias and telling us a little bit about Papias' sources. Similarly, so Papias himself, as I say, he lived from 60 AD to about 130 AD. So he's born a generation after Jesus. But actually within events that cover the end of the New Testament. The New Testament kind of covers events right the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and Papias is born just before that. So he's very close, which is why he writes about having conversations with John the Elder and with Aristian and so on, and others he refers to. he doesn't tell us who they are, but he just says, when anyone who actually travelled with Jesus, I would like to talk to them. There's another testimony, which is Irenaeus, who's living from around 115 to about 200. So it's still not that big a distance. And as I say, he kind of connects very nicely as Papias is kind of closing down. Irenaeus himself was a disciple of a guy called Polycarp. And Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle. Irenaeus tells us that John the Elder is the same person as John the beloved disciple, that the author of the Gospel is John the Apostle, not John the Elder. So a slight contradiction there, you see, between Eusebius and Irenaeus, but in one sense, that's not addressing the issue in terms of the Gospels being written by people with those names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's just which one exactly they were is kind of in question. But anyway, I'm going right off piece now. Let's stick with it. Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Apostle, he tells us that Matthew composed his gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul proclaimed the gospel in Rome. So, well, Peter, as I say, got there in the 40s, and Paul. So there seems to be a kind of a stretch or a long period from 40s to the 60s, because Paul doesn't get there until about the early 60s, isn't it? I think 60ish or so. I have to look that one up. So he kind of gives it a 20-year period, but that's not unreasonable, because we're going to see as I start to kind of spell out, if we ever get to that point, or if I ever do a long teaching just on this process, the way I actually present the emergence of Matthew is over a period of time, similarly with Luke. That actually it starts with kind of short sections, because you see Matthew is broken into those kind of sections being distributed around the churches in Jerusalem, and then it's probably later kind of compiled into something bigger, and it may well not be that it didn't get finished until kind of in the 60s, which would mean that, if you like, the Greek version that we have now kind of finally takes shape over a period of time. And that's the way I think is the best way of understanding. You can't prove it, but I think it makes logical sense, and it kind of fits with Irenaeus' statement. So it's from when Peter is there, he starts there in the 40s, early 40s, right the way through to the mid 60s. It's being Matthew is kind of finally coming together, but there's probably been a version with most of it in Hebrew for quite a long while. And so while Peter and Paul proclaimed the gospel in Rome and founded their community there, and then he uses a word that can mean either departure or death. After either their departure or their death, and of course it's a bit ambiguous, because both Peter went to Rome and then left, and Paul went to Rome and then left, and then Peter came back and was executed, and Paul came back and was executed. So the phrase could kind of refer to either things. It says, if you think of it like that, but either after their death or their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed on his preaching to us in written form. So Irenaeus is very clear in that Matthew's come first, and it was kind of there, and while Peter while Peter and Paul were there in Rome, Matthew's gospel is around, it's there. And then afterwards, we've still got Mark's gospel. And so some have taken that and said, oh, well, if we take really Paul doesn't get there till the 60s, so it must mean their death, and it must be late. But if you take the whole flow of Irenaeus' argument, his argument is about the continuity of testimony. And so what he's saying is that in Rome, we have a testimony that started with real live people. Peter came here, Paul came here, but when they came, they had a gospel that Matthew had written, and it was there during all the time when they were at Rome. But now they've gone, now those people aren't around anymore, they've died. We've still got the testimony that was written to us, which is taken down verbatim from Peter as he preached, which is the Gospel of Mark. So the kind of, he's not so much making a date issue, he's much more kind of creating a sense of continuity. So in that sense, he doesn't give us perhaps a precise, definitive word, but what we do see is Matthew first and Mark second, and then we kind of add that to further testimony. So for instance, I mentioned beginning the testimony of a guy called Pantaeus, who was a missionary. Pantaeus, this is being told by Jerome, who's kind of giving us the history of Pantaeus. He went to the Indians. Now he's talking about the Roman province of India, which is not exactly coincident with the area that we think of as India nowadays, but kind of hits the northern border. So he went into that kind of area. And the tradition is that he found among them there some who had known Christ. So he gets there, and Pantanaeus, as I say, dies at the end of the 2nd century. He goes as a missionary to that region. He gets and discovers there are already disciples there. And the gospel according to Matthew had preceded his coming. So they already have the gospel according to Matthew. And then we're told it's because Bartholomew had taken it to them. So Bartholomew, it seems, therefore probably within the generation of those who've travelled and ministered with Jesus, one of the 12 has made it to the Roman province of India. And although they had lost the tradition, by the time a missionary gets there in a later generation, Pantanaeus, he discovers there's already a church there that was founded by Bartholomew, and he had left them the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew letters. There's no comment as to whether they could read those or not, but he gets there and discovers they've actually got a copy of this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And so although Jerome himself is quite late, he's kind of, we understand he is passing on a tradition that is in one sense has been solidly held for the generations before, and he's just making sure it's all properly captured, which was about a later missionary trip that confirmed that actually the gospel had already come there, and they have the gospel in Hebrew. So anyway, he goes on then to say that actually Pantanaeus brought the Hebrew gospel back to Alexandria, and I think he kind of makes reference to the fact that it's there if you want to go and read it in the library. And that kind of ties in again. You see, again we've got this growing testimony. Matthew first, writing in Hebrew, which makes sense of the early phases where the church is centered in Jerusalem, even though it's spreading, kind of circling out, getting wider and wider, 100 miles or so. So then we read a guy called Epiphanius, who is the bishop of Salamis. He tells us that they in this context is a group, the Ebionites and the Nazareans, have the gospel according to Matthew, complete and in Hebrew. And so he mentions this group, the Nazareans, which he says actually have the thing. And that seems to be corroborated in a totally separate comment from Jerome, who tells us that Matthew, which was first composed the gospel in Hebrew, and furthermore the Hebrew is preserved to the present day in the library at Caesarea, and I had leave given to me to copy it by the Nazareans in Beroea. So there's a copy in the library at Caesarea, and also there's a group called the Nazareans, almost the same spelling as the one we have from Epiphanius, but therefore independent. The Nazareans, who have their own copy, and I actually was able to copy that down. So Jerome isn't just saying from the 4th century, oh, I've just heard once upon a time. He's saying I've actually seen it. And I can tell you where you can go and look at it. The obvious place for you to go is the library in Caesarea, but actually I've seen it and I copied it down from the Nazareans, which is a city in Syria, who use this work. He goes on to say who use this work. So they use this. So you're getting it's not just a kind of a vague idea. You get a very strong testimony. Matthew first, written in Hebrew, which could mean Aramaic in a very general sense, or it could be the more, as it turns out, there's a more kind of Aramaized trying to find the right word for it, version of Hebrew, which you find written in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's kind of more like classical Hebrew, but kind of with some impact. Either of those, it could be the possibility, but actually it's all a consistent message. And then, as I say, if we've actually got a copy of the text that could well be that. So Matthew comes out very strongly as being that kind of the early writer in this kind of situation. I've got a whole list of stuff, but this isn't the point of this video. It's to just kind of give you confidence in the approach we're taking on Aramaisms in Matthew. Just one thing just to kind of note is we read, one of the things you might have noticed is most of the Gospels refer to the kingdom of God, but the Matthew tends to refer to the kingdom of heaven. And actually that is an Aramaism, because there were, in the 1st century, there were those that were kind of cautious about using the word God and would often substitute it with the word heaven. It wasn't universal, but some were like that, and Matthew, writing into that context, would want to be sensitive to those folks. But what's really interesting is the Greek doesn't. The Greek actually, the Greek text we have of Matthew doesn't say the kingdom of heaven. It says the kingdom of heavens. which actually is the way you would say it if you were writing in Hebrew or Aramaic, because the word heaven is a plural word, not a singular word, and it makes much more logical sense for those who analyze these kinds of things if the Greek version was based on the translation of the Hebrew, but because it's already considered to be scripture, people would want to be very accurate, so they would leave it as the kingdom of heavens in the plural. Whereas if it was being composed by a Greek thinker in Greek originally, they would have gone for the Greek way, which is heaven is a singular word. So just one of those little kind of touches where you can see this evidence. And there's loads of things like that in the Gospel of Matthew, which make much more sense if they have originally been written in Hebrew or Aramaic. So I think we've probably had enough. So yes, we've had enough from Matthew. I've got other things I could comment on, but I want to kind of get on because I don't want to, don't want these to be too long. Just look at the testimony around Mark. So again, we go back to Papias. Interesting, one of the few things that sometimes the modern scholarship try to say shows a different order.